experience around this in disaster recovery. Well, our next speaker, Professor Helen Cahill from University of Melbourne, has long-standing experience in disaster recovery using the arts and from a health perspective. Please welcome her.
So I have a special connection in my heart for families who have the experience of being trapped by bushfire from the time when I was caught at home as a young mum with my 2 little daughters while the helicopters dropped the water on our roof and it was too late to leave. And being perplexed, even though I was an educator, as to why it took sort of a year for them to want to be able to be around a birthday cake candle. And did that mean you couldn't go to parties? And what was an educative recovery response? And what was recovery? And living in a fire risk community and watching my own children grieve for the parents, the lost parents and lost homes of their school friends in the 2009 fires. And recently thinking with a lot of pride about the thinking of one of those daughters as she was evacuated from her community over this summer, but is thinking now chiefly about going back to her school and what will they do to make school great and safe, whilst also still obviously being triggered by this kind of distress. So my quest into those kind of questions intersects with my role in general education practice pretty well in the area of student wellbeing. And as we know, schools play multiple roles in disaster recovery, prevention, response. But I'm going to focus just particularly today on the contribution schools can make through their ongoing provision of routine education practices within their core curriculum in the area that we call social and emotional learning. Now, unlike arts education, there's been a huge amount of money around the world to do massive amounts of research, including randomised controlled trial studies in multiple countries, into the impact of what we call social emotional learning. So it's got a massive evidence base. And that evidence base tells us that when we provide in schools as part of the curriculum delivered by teachers, explicit social emotional learning in primary and secondary contexts, that it has really positive benefits for young people's mental health. They're less likely to suffer from anxiety and depression, skills to improve emotional regulation, how they manage their feelings, how they express their feelings, particularly important in the post-disaster experience. They lead to improved classroom social behaviours, making the class more teachable and also a better place for children to be, because they too are troubled when their peers are off track in their behaviour, because they're living with that as well, and it interferes with their sense of safety in the classroom, as well as their focus on learning. It improved connections to teachers, to school and to learning. So the research shows that teachers who provide social emotional learning programs also become more socially emotionally literate. It's good for their mental health. And most positively, I think, they feel more connected to their students and begin to adopt more democratic, more participatory and student-centric teaching practices across their work. It's good for academic attainment. They're the 21st century skills for employability in our now precarious labour markets. Let's not forget those young people who left their school as a year 12 and are now coming to the academy without a school to go to for the first time in their life. What a terrible loss they're experiencing at this time. So they'll be playing in precarious labour markets, some of them. Others will be entering unfriendly institutions in the name of universities who fail to also provide something at this time as they should. I'm proud to say that mine is making plans. So one of the other things that's very interesting to me about the more recent research into what contribution social emotional learning can make is that all kids who do social emotional learning programs as part of their core work at school are less likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder if they are impacted or the community is impacted by a disaster. So we know it's good for kids, and it's good for kids who might experience the worst of the worst. So the other key message for us, which I think is very uplifting for the profession, is that the programs are most effective when they're delivered by the teacher in the curriculum with the ongoing relationship with the class. In fact, there have been studies comparing interventions delivered by teachers and those that are more therapeutic, delivered to small groups by specialist sort of psychologized skills educators. the universal interventions in the classroom can produce better results. Let's imagine why. Because they are equipping a peer group to also provide support for each other's mental and social health. Children, particularly as they go into adolescence, are incredibly unlikely to ask specialised adults for help. In fact, any adults at all for help. Who do they turn to? Their peer group. So therefore, investing in the peer group is strengthening their protective factors. The study, by the way, that showed the prevention of effect, once exposed to disaster, is only one particular study at this time. I'm not going to overclaim from that evidence base. But this Israeli study you can see described here, the Israeli situation of waiting for a possible disaster to impact, but not knowing when, and then it does, is not so different from waiting for a bushfire. I'm particularly mindful right now, as being also an evacuated person during this time, and of the children who left, but the fire didn't come, but might still. Now, our place-based responses to emergencies don't tend to notice anything beyond the immediate locale of a disaster. But in Australia this time, we have what I would call a distributed disaster. It's intensified in certain places with heightened impact, but there is almost no child going to any school who isn't coming with a disaster story in their mind, and in some schools that will not be recognised. We won't necessarily know who was caught on a holiday. We won't necessarily know who spent way too much time watching it on the television, way too much for their own good. So we actually don't know who's affected when we go back this time. So good practice would say, presume everyone is, and that will guide your practice. So the other thing we know from research in disaster support is that, understandably, most of the work goes in the immediate aftermath, but there's not as much attention or investment into what's the longer term recovery. And we've heard from pretty well all of the speakers so far that investment in longer term recovery is really, really important, because kids get through the aftermath, but they still have to do the ongoing work of building their life and rebuilding a life whilst living life itself, which just always presents challenges anyway for any kid. So the programs that teach social emotional skills post-disaster are contributing to what we would call the longer term recovery effort, and they're playing out over time in the school. At the same time, I'd also like to remind us that as educators, these are also times where it is our good practices that are already there that we can lean on. We don't have to invent something new in the area of generic good practice. So our whole school approaches to being trauma aware also continue to be useful. Our school-wide positive behaviour supports continue to be really, really important, as well as any of our exercise that we've had previously in partnership and working with others for good pastoral and social care in schools. A little bit though about contributing through the arts. One of the things we could argue that is most powerful about working through the arts is that they use collaborative teaching strategies. So again, a better funded area of research than arts is use of collaborative learning. So what we see in studies that investigate just teachers who use collaborative methods, whether they're on the topic of wellbeing or not, is they have immediate benefits for building social support and enhancing help seeking between peers and students and teachers. So working together, shifting from the me to the we, is a really powerful turn that arts educators automatically have in their practice, and they don't need to bring in a new topic of focus. They can trust they already have health promoting practices. But I don't want us to over-glorify the arts, because one of the things I'm aware of as a critical youth scholar, particularly when you start working with teenagers in high school around the use of the arts, and you understand the performativity pressures that come on teenagers as they start to strive for aesthetic standards in their art making and try to be seen to be good at what they do and look good when they do it themselves, is it can push them into modes of using the arts that are actually unhelpful on this topic. So we really need the facilitator to stay aware of when story making and art making can tend towards, inadvertently, we don't do it on purpose, they don't do it on purpose, but inadvertently tend to do what I would call these problematicises: pathologise, demonise, trivialise, sensationalise, polarise, and re-traumatise by overly dwelling on the traumatic story, which therapists have found through researching psychological practice. What was once held to be good practice in therapy has been interrupted We have this lay understanding as well that how therapy works is you tell your story over and over and then somehow you get better. But that actually doesn't work in quite the same way with reliving trauma stories. It can be re-traumatizing. But a teacher running a class can find you've got heightened engagement when we tell a horror story in the room because everyone's so engaged. And they read student engagement as something that's productive for well-being. Engagement through sensationalization is not the same as productive well-being education. Sometimes give up a little bit of tragedy tourism, engagement through horror. On the other hand, our strengths are really in this area. The productive C's: connect, collaborate, curate, critique, contribute with compassion, create possibility and hope. Check up your arts practice. Does it grow purpose, control and relationship? If it does, you're on the right track. If you need resources, there's lots out there. Social-emotional learning resources provided open access by the Victorian Department of Education. A research literature review, a summary of good practice, available open access on the Youth Research Centre website, University of Melbourne. And all of your systems are already providing you good resources and advice. So nobody should go anywhere with nothing.
Thanks, Helen. As Helen